So what defines Last Epoch? Well, according to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, an epoch is an event or a time marked by... Hey YouTube, welcome back. We are talking about the differences between Last Epoch and Path of Exile. So Path of Exile started open access almost 10 years ago, and Last Epoch is still in early access. So I want to highlight my top 5 differences between Path of Exile and Last Epoch, and what I think sets Last Epoch apart as like its own game altogether. Action RPGs tend to be lumped in all the same category. Maybe you'll call them Diablo clones, and it makes sense. Diablo 1 and Diablo 2 were extremely impactful games, and people want more of that. People want to kill hundreds and thousands of monsters. People want to look for that perfect piece of gear for their build, and they want to min-max over a long period of time. That said, I think there are some core differences between Last Epoch and Path of Exile. For reference, Path of Exile is currently in Ultimatum League, so that's the league that's going on while I'm making this video here. So let's talk about all 5 things that set these games apart. Thing number 1. In Path of Exile, if you have a 100% chance to ignite something, you will ignite something. Well, actually... Stop it, you know what I mean. In Last Epoch, on the other hand, if you have a 100% chance to ignite something, you'll always ignite something once. But if you go over that chance, you could have a 150% chance to ignite something, and that means that you have a 100% chance to ignite once, and a 50% chance to ignite for a second time. If you're familiar with Path of Exile, you'll know that this sounds a lot like the Atlas system. If you have 100 Atlas completion, that means that you have a 100% chance for a map to drop as a +1. But if you have 120 Atlas completion in Path of Exile, that means that you have a 100% chance for a map to drop as a +1, and then an additional 20% chance for that map to drop as a +2 instead. Let's open the in-game guide and take a look at this. If we type in ailment here, we see a very important line of text right next to where my mouse is on the screen. It says, for example, if I have a 235% ignite chance with Fireball, each Fireball hit will apply 2 stacks of Ignite, with a 35% chance to apply a 3rd stack of Ignite. This has awesome ramifications for when you're building your character in Last Epoch. Just be sure to look up your respective ailment in the in-game guide to make sure that the ailment works the way that you want it to. This stacking mechanic should work for Bleed, Ignite, Shock, Poison, what have you. Okay, defining characteristic number 2 of Last Epoch. Your mana is a problem. For me, coming from Path of Exile, mana tends to be pretty binary. It's not the most interesting mechanic. Either you have enough mana or mana regeneration or reduced mana cost of skills that you can mindlessly spam your skills at 1000 RPM, or you don't. In Last Epoch, on the other hand, it feels as though the developers wanted to make a conscious decision to turn mana into a complicated problem that becomes a core part of your build. Now, because there's no life flasks and because there's no mana flask in Last Epoch, your base mana regeneration and life regeneration in Last Epoch are a lot higher than they would be in a game like Path of Exile, where you need to spec into these things to have any regeneration at all. So in Last Epoch, maybe the way that you want to solve your mana is just by having a lot of mana regeneration and maybe some flat mana, percent mana to go along with it to make that mana regeneration feel good. But that is certainly not the only approach here. There are plenty of builds in Last Epoch that end up using a 2-skill system with something that I call a mana battery. One skill will be consuming mana and probably be doing a lot of damage because of that. Maybe you'll be turning up the mana cost super high to get some other damage out of it. And the other skill, for me, this melee attack called Tempest Strike, on use or maybe on hit, it recovers a flat amount or a percentage amount of mana, and it allows me to get back my mana very quickly while I'm doing my maps, while I'm doing my echoes. Another important distinction between the mana system of Last Epoch and the mana system of a game like Path of Exile is that in Last Epoch, your mana can go negative. For those of you who have played Dark Souls in the past, you might already be familiar with this, because Dark Souls, the stamina system that they have there, is kind of similar to this. We're allowed to go negative with our mana as long as, when we start the cast of the skill, we have a positive amount of mana. And because I have a skill that costs no mana that I use as a mana battery, I can use that to recover mana and go back in my positive numbers quickly. Defining characteristic number 3. The gear in Last Epoch is a lot simpler than Path of Exile. Disregard the fact that one of these games is almost 10 years older than the other one. So let's take a look at a simple piece of gear like these gloves that I'm showing here on the screen. First things first, the implicit. These gloves only have 15 armor, but you might also have gloves that have cast speed or 40 cold res, or maybe melee attack speed. So the implicits of these gloves, which means the base glove that you're trying to pick up off the ground, or maybe the base glove that you're putting in your loot filter, it's very impactful. You really want to have the right base type for all of your gear. Okay, so let's get back to prefixes and suffixes. In Path of Exile, you have 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes. So even if your build only makes use of 5 of those affixes without making use of the 6th, you can still absolutely smash the endgame of Path of Exile. You don't need all the power of having 6 perfect affixes on your gear at all times. Do you, Harvest? Now, on the other hand, in Last Epoch, we only have 2 prefixes and 2 suffixes. Our life and our resistances are always going to be suffixes in Last Epoch, And our damage modifiers are basically always going to be prefixes. This means that the cost of having the wrong affix on a piece of gear in Last Epoch is a lot more substantial than in Path of Exile. Real quick, let's talk about one of the pitfalls that new players fall into in Path of Exile and how that's mitigated in Last Epoch, whether for good or for bad. So on the screen here, I have a scepter that I'm using for my physical spell caster character in Last Epoch. Now you can tell just by looking at this which of these affixes are prefixes and suffixes, because the prefixes have two small arrows on the left side of the dialog box, and the two suffixes have arrows on the right side of the dialog box. Let's take a look at the purple modifier here. This is 164% increased physical damage, and this is global. In Path of Exile, there's a lot of pitfalls that might catch a new player off guard. Maybe local versus global attack speed or increased physical damage on a weapon. Maybe local versus global energy shield if you find it on a ring as opposed to finding it on a pair of gloves. Now in Last Epoch, on the other hand, virtually every modifier that you find will be global and it'll affect the entire character. Last Epoch has one exception to this right now, and that is with critical strike chance, as far as I know. Critical strike chance, if you find that affix on your weapon, it only applies to hitting things with your weapon, so it applies to attacks. On the other hand, if you found critical strike chance on a ring, for example, that would apply to both your weapons, your attacks, and your spells. I don't really like this discrepancy. I think Last Epoch should just embrace it and make everything global all the time, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, number 4. In Last Epoch, there are no portal scrolls. You have a portal button. There's also no wisdom scrolls, because you don't need them. Every item drops on the ground identified, which means when it comes to loot filters, you have a tremendous amount of power over what you do and don't see when you're farming maps in Last Epoch. Before I show you exactly how strong the loot filters are, I will say this. During the leveling process, before level 55 or so, when you're still working through the Last Epoch campaign, I found loot filters to be a little bit hard to use. I ended up hiding magic items, hiding white items, and I ended up highlighting things that have maybe life and res, or maybe just highlighting boots that have movement speed. I couldn't really hide too much stuff because all of my gear was pretty bad the entire time. That said, once I beat the campaign around level 55 or so and started doing monoliths, started doing echoes, the loot filter, at least to me, became a lot more manageable. Let's pretend like we know exactly what we want to farm, and let's add it to our loot filter right now. So the loot filter by default is Shift F. Let's click Add Rule and see what's going on here. We can show, hide, and recolor stuff. Just remember that recolor also shows stuff. It wouldn't really make sense to recolor something if you're not also showing it on your loot filter. So let's recolor something. We'll make something drop nice and blue, how about? Let's add a condition. In our conditions, because every item drops identified already, we can click on exactly what affix we want. We can show what tier of the affix we want, and we even have more granularity than that. We can put level restrictions on the items that are dropping. We can say that we only want to see white or magic or maybe exalted items that have drop only tier 6 or tier 7 modifiers on them. For our item types, we can show exactly an offhand. Let's say we want a shield. And maybe for subtypes, we can also click on exactly what kind of shield we want. Maybe we only want a shield that has plus 75 poison res on it as well, because we really want to cap our defenses. So let's add another condition. Currently I'm playing a primalist, so I don't want to see stuff that drops for other classes. I don't want to get excited and then not be able to use the item. So let's make sure that we click on primalist here. Let's add another condition in. I only want to use a shield that has an affix of health. Maybe hybrid health, maybe flat health, maybe percent health. But as long as it has one of these things, maybe added, increased, percent health, or hybrid health, as long as it has one of those, I think I'm happy. But I don't really want tier 1. I want something that has at least tier 3 or at least tier 4 so that I can craft up the rest of the item or maybe fix up those affixes without fracturing my item later on. Believe me when I say that these loot filters are super strong, and the degree to which you dig into these loot filters and find out exactly what it is you want to farm for your build and what you want to find while you're chaining echo after echo, that's going to have a big impact on how your experience is during the endgame. And for our 5th defining characteristic of Last Epoch compared to a game like Path of Exile, currency and gold. So before we talk about Last Epoch, let's talk about Path of Exile. Path of Exile has no gold, and because of that, all the currency is stuff that you can actually use on your items. Every alteration, chaos, Val Orb, Bless, Divine, Exalt, all of those things in PoE are things that you use on your gear to make it better, or sometimes with a Val Orb to make it worse. Now in any economy that doesn't have a gold standard or doesn't have a dollar bill that we're trading back and forth, including in video game economies, there's going to be something that emerges as the default dollar bill, the default gold. Now in Path of Exile, for the most part, the default currency that arises as the de facto form of trading is the Chaos Orb. Virtually everyone will always be willing to trade with you if you can provide a sufficient amount of chaos, of your dollar bills. If you want to see a counterpoint to this, go do a short-term private league, or maybe a private league that only has a couple people in it. You'll see that oftentimes Chaos Orb is not the thing that people want to trade for. Maybe they want to trade for Legion Splinters, or maybe they want to trade for Fusings because they're trying to 6-link some Carcass Jack or some chess piece that they found on the ground. So even if you're playing Path of Exile as an SSF or solo self-found game, you can still use your currency to craft your gear, or for the other very important currency sync that exists in PoE, you can use your map device. In Softcore Trade League, if there's a compelling thing to use on your map device, maybe if Harvest is good and costs 12 chaos, or maybe if Beyond is on the map device, or Nemesis, back when you could only chance a Headhunter in a Nemesis map. So crafting, the fact that all the currency in Path of Exile is consumable, along with the map device, which encourages you to juice up your maps and make them as profitable as possible, those are gold sinks that eliminate currency from the economy altogether. So what about Last Epoch? What does Last Epoch have? Well, we have this guy,
Unlucky?
and he allows us to gamble. We can use our gold to buy things from him. The items might be white, they might be magic, rare, they might even be unique items. You could spend 1 million, 2 million, maybe 3 million gold if you're unlucky, trying to get exactly the right unique item by buying things from the gambler. And then Last Epoch also has nothing. That's it. That's the entire gold sink of this game. You can technically use your gold in order to buy more inventory space. You can go to your stash and click on the plus sign and spend in-game currency to get new stashes. But really, there's no real currency sink. There's no real reason for you not to have 1 billion or 2 billion gold sitting in your inventory, because there's really not much to use your gold. Epoch is currently in early access. I assume that there's going to be a new currency sink in the future, and this is why I think that. Last Epoch is a plan to be a multiplayer game. It wants to be multiplayer. It wants to let you co-op and team up with your friends. It wants to be multiplayer in the same way that Path of Exile is multiplayer, which means there'll be an economy and there'll be people selling things to each other. My current concern for Last Epoch is that when this game becomes multiplayer and there's an economy and you can trade things to one another, if the developers around that time, if they don't also put in another gold sink or something else to do with your gold to remove it from the economy altogether, the prices will be hyperinflated. And the last thing you want to see as a new player jumping into a game is that one piece of gear that you want to buy from someone else costs 5 million gold. 5 million is not a number that we can parse in our heads very well. 20 gold, 100 gold, 1,000 gold, maybe 10,000 gold. I can understand as a new player what I need to do in order to get to that. But 5 million, 10 million, 100 million gold just to buy something because the prices will be so inflated and there's nothing else to use my currency on, to me, that doesn't sound so good. I'm sure the Last Epoch developers have something in their back pocket to address that when the time comes. But right now, I just don't think there's enough gold sinks in this game. There's not enough stuff to do with my money. So that's it. Those are my top 5 characteristics about Last Epoch that differentiate it from other games in the genre, things like Path of Exile. But what do you think? What sets apart Last Epoch from other games in the action RPG genre? Let me know in the comments of this video what you think sets apart, maybe even what doesn't set apart Last Epoch from other games in the same genre. That's it for this video. I'll see you next time.